In the winter of 1442, an 11-year-old boy stood at the threshold of hell, disguised as paradise. Vlad Dracula, second son of Vlad II Dracul, ruler of Wallachia, was delivered into Ottoman hands not as a prisoner of war, but as collateral in a political arrangement his father could not refuse. The boy prince, along with his younger brother Radu, entered the gates of the Ottoman palace in Edirne, surrounded by marble columns and golden mosaics that reflected the empire's wealth and power. Yet behind this splendor lay a system designed to break the spirit of conquered peoples and remake their children into instruments of the Sultan's will. What the Ottomans intended as education would become something far darker, a crucible of psychological torment that would forge one of history's most terrifying rulers. The practice of taking hostages from vassal states was a cornerstone of Ottoman imperial strategy during the 15th century. Known as the Devashirme system, when applied to Christian boys converted to serve the Sultan, the hostage arrangement with noble families served a dual purpose: ensuring the loyalty of conquered territories while indoctrinating future leaders in Ottoman culture and submission. Vlad II Dracul, desperate to maintain his precarious throne in Wallachia, had little choice but to comply with Sultan Murad II's demand. Wallachia occupied a strategic position between the expanding Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe, making it a constant battleground for influence. By surrendering his sons, Dracul hoped to secure Ottoman support against his rivals and buy time for his fragile reign. The palace where young Vlad found himself was a world of contradictions. On the surface, it offered luxuries beyond imagination: silk garments, elaborate feasts, gardens filled with exotic flowers, and tutors who taught languages, mathematics, and the arts of war. Yet this gilded cage operated on principles of absolute control and psychological manipulation. The young princes were never allowed to forget their status as hostages, dependent entirely on their captors' mercy. They witnessed the casual brutality that maintained Ottoman order, executions carried out in palace courtyards, the torture of those who displeased the Sultan, and the systematic humiliation of anyone who dared resist. For a proud boy whose father bore the title Dracul, meaning dragon or devil, this forced submission was intolerable. The Ottoman method of education for noble hostages went far beyond academic instruction. It was a deliberate process of psychological breaking, designed to create either loyal servants or broken shells of men. The boys were separated from everything familiar: their language, their Orthodox Christian faith, their culture, and any sense of autonomy. They were subjected to rigorous military training that included not just combat skills, but lessons in cruelty and intimidation. Young Vlad watched as Ottoman soldiers demonstrated methods of torture and execution, learning that fear was the most effective weapon of all. He saw men impaled on stakes, their bodies displayed as warnings to others. He observed beheadings, flayings, and mutilations carried out with clinical precision. These were not random acts of violence, but calculated demonstrations of power, lessons the Ottomans intended their hostage princes to internalize and eventually employ in service of the empire. The contrast between the two brothers' responses to captivity reveals the success and failure of Ottoman methods. Radu, the younger and more physically attractive of the two, adapted to his circumstances with remarkable ease. Historical accounts suggest he became a favorite of the young Prince Mehmed, later Sultan Mehmed II, forming a relationship that may have been more than friendship. Radu embraced Ottoman culture, converted to Islam, and eventually became a trusted Ottoman commander, fighting against his own homeland. He learned to navigate the palace's dangerous politics through charm and submission, earning privileges and protection by becoming exactly what the Ottomans wanted him to be. His capitulation was complete, his transformation from Wallachian prince to Ottoman loyalist a testament to the effectiveness of their system. Vlad's response was entirely different and infinitely more dangerous. Where Radu bent, Vlad hardened. Where Radu sought favor, Vlad nursed hatred. Contemporary sources describe the young Vlad as proud, defiant, and impossible to break, despite years of punishment and humiliation. He endured beatings for refusing to show proper deference, solitary confinement for acts of resistance, and constant psychological pressure to submit. Yet instead of breaking him, each punishment seemed to forge his character into something colder and more ruthless. He learned the Ottoman lessons in cruelty and intimidation, but not with the intention of serving his captors. He studied their methods of torture, their strategies of psychological warfare, and their use of terror as a governing tool with the focused intensity of a student who plans to surpass his teachers. The Ottomans were creating a weapon they could not control, sharpening a blade that would one day be turned against them. The 6 years Vlad spent in Ottoman captivity, from ages 11 to 17, coincided with his most formative developmental period. Psychological research has long established that trauma during adolescence fundamentally shapes personality, worldview, and behavioral patterns. For Vlad, already predisposed to pride and ambition by his noble birth and family heritage, the experience of powerlessness and degradation created a psychological wound that would never heal. He learned that mercy was weakness, that fear was more reliable than love, and that only absolute power could guarantee survival. He witnessed firsthand how the Ottomans maintained control over vast territories, not through justice or benevolence, but through systematic terror and the strategic use of horrific violence. These lessons would become the foundation of his own approach to governance. During these years, news from Wallachia brought further trauma. In 1447, Vlad received word that his father and older brother Mircea had been killed. Vlad II Dracul was assassinated by Wallachian nobles allied with John Hunyadi, the Hungarian regent who viewed Dracul's Ottoman sympathies as treason against Christendom. Mircea's death was even more brutal. He was captured, tortured, and buried alive at the order of these same nobles. The teenage Vlad, still held hostage in Ottoman territory, was powerless to avenge his family or claim his rightful inheritance. This helplessness, combined with the knowledge that his father's attempts at political maneuvering had ultimately destroyed their family, deepened Vlad's conviction that only ruthless strength could ensure survival. He learned that attempting to please multiple masters led to destruction, that compromise was fatal, and that rulers must dominate completely or be destroyed themselves. The Ottomans eventually released Vlad in 1448, installing him as Prince of Wallachia with Ottoman military support. They believed they had created a puppet ruler who would govern in their interest, having spent 6 formative years under their control. They could not have been more mistaken. Vlad's first reign lasted only 2 months before he was overthrown by rivals backed by John Hunyadi, forcing him into exile. Yet this brief taste of power only intensified his determination. Over the following years, as he plotted his return to power, Vlad's personality continued to harden. He had learned patience in the Ottoman palace, but also the value of decisive, overwhelming action. He had absorbed the lesson that fear could accomplish what diplomacy and kindness could not. When he finally reclaimed the Wallachian throne in 1456, he returned not as the broken hostage the Ottomans had tried to create, but as something they had inadvertently forged, a ruler who would wield terror with unprecedented skill and conviction. Vlad's second reign began with a systematic campaign to consolidate power through methods that shocked even the violent 15th century. On Easter Sunday of 1459, he invited the Wallachian nobility to a feast, an apparent gesture of reconciliation with the boyars who had killed his father and brother. When the nobles arrived with their families, dressed in their finest garments, Vlad's soldiers surrounded them. The older boyars were impaled immediately on stakes erected in the palace courtyard. The younger nobles and their families were forced to march over 60 miles to the ruins of Poenari Castle, where they were compelled to rebuild the fortress that would become Vlad's mountain stronghold. Many died from exhaustion during the construction. This single act eliminated the noble class that had opposed his family, demonstrated his willingness to use extreme violence, and created a labor force to build his defensive position. It was political calculation, married to personal vengeance, executed with ruthless efficiency. Impalement became Vlad's signature method of execution and psychological warfare, a technique he had observed during his Ottoman captivity and now employed with systematic intensity. The process was designed to maximize suffering and create a spectacle of terror. A wooden stake, carefully smoothed and oiled to prevent immediate death, was inserted through the victim's body, typically entering through the rectum or abdomen and emerging near the shoulder. The stake was then raised vertically and planted in the ground, leaving the victim to die slowly over hours, or even days, as gravity pulled their body downward onto the stake. Vlad's executioners became skilled at positioning the stake to avoid vital organs, prolonging the agony. Victims would scream, writhe, and beg for mercy while crowds were forced to watch, learning the cost of opposing their prince. The scale of Vlad's use of impalement distinguished him from other rulers who employed torture and execution. Contemporary accounts, though possibly exaggerated by enemies seeking to demonize him, describe forests of impaled bodies surrounding Wallachian towns. German pamphlets published after Vlad's death, among the earliest examples of propaganda printing, depicted him dining among impaled victims, their blood soaking the ground around his table. Ottoman sources describe entire villages impaled as punishment for supporting Turkish raiders. While exact numbers are disputed by historians, even conservative estimates suggest Vlad was responsible for tens of thousands of deaths by impalement during his reign. He did not reserve this punishment for enemies and criminals alone. Merchants who cheated customers, nobles who showed insufficient loyalty, and entire communities suspected of Ottoman sympathies faced the stake. The psychological impact of Vlad's methods extended far beyond the immediate victims. He understood that terror could serve as a governing tool more effective than armies or bureaucracy. Crime virtually disappeared in Wallachia during his reign, not because of justice or prosperity, but because potential criminals knew the punishment would be swift, public, and agonizing. Foreign merchants reported they could leave gold in the streets and return to find it untouched. This was not evidence of moral transformation, but of population-level trauma, an entire society paralyzed by fear of their ruler's wrath. Vlad demonstrated his commitment to this principle through symbolic acts, such as placing a golden cup by a public fountain. The cup remained there throughout his reign, used freely by travelers but never stolen, a testament to the power of terror to enforce order. Vlad's treatment of the poor, sick and disabled revealed the extent to which his captivity had warped his conception of proper governance. According to multiple sources, he invited beggars, vagrants and the chronically ill to a great feast in Targovishte. When they had eaten and drunk their fill, Vlad asked if they wished to live free of worldly cares and troubles. When they answered affirmatively, he ordered the building locked and set aflame, burning everyone inside. He later explained this mass murder as an act of mercy, claiming he had freed them from suffering while simultaneously cleansing Wallachia of those who could not contribute to the state. This logic, viewing human beings as purely instrumental and those deemed useless as worthy only of elimination, reflected the dehumanizing lessons he had absorbed in Ottoman captivity, where human life had value only in relation to the Sultan's interests. The Ottoman Empire, which had held Vlad hostage and believed him cowed, soon learned the terrible mistake of their assumption. In 1459, Sultan Mehmed II, fresh from his conquest of Constantinople in 1453, demanded that Vlad pay tribute and present himself at the Ottoman court. Vlad's response demonstrated both his strategic cunning and his appetite for theatrical cruelty. When Ottoman envoys arrived to deliver the Sultan's summons, Vlad asked why they did not remove their turbans in his presence. They replied that it was their custom to keep their heads covered even before the Sultan. Vlad responded by ordering his guards to nail the turbans to the envoys' heads with iron spikes, declaring he was merely helping them maintain their custom. He then sent the mutilated envoys back to Mehmed as his answer to the demand for tribute. This act of defiance initiated a conflict that would define Vlad's reign and legacy. He launched raids across the Danube into Ottoman territory, attacking Turkish fortresses and settlements with savage efficiency. His methods were designed not just to kill Ottoman soldiers, but to terrorize the empire's civilian population. Villages were burned, their inhabitants impaled or tortured to death. Vlad sent letters to Hungarian and other European courts detailing his victories, listing the number of Turks killed and including severed body parts as proof. These missives, written in German and Latin, portrayed him as a Christian crusader fighting against Islamic expansion, earning him support from some European powers who conveniently ignored his methods in favor of his results. In reality, Vlad's war was deeply personal. Vengeance against the empire that had stolen his childhood and attempted to break his will. The culmination of this conflict came in 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II personally led an army of approximately 100,000 men into Wallachia, determined to crush the upstart prince who had humiliated his empire. Vlad commanded a force estimated at only 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers, hopelessly outnumbered in conventional military terms. Yet Vlad had never intended to fight a conventional war. He had learned from his Ottoman captors that psychological warfare could be more devastating than any battle. As Mehmed's massive army advanced through Wallachia, they found a country transformed into a nightmare landscape. Villages had been burned and abandoned, their populations either evacuated or killed. Wells were poisoned, fields torched, and livestock slaughtered. The Ottoman army found no food, no water, no shelter, and no visible enemy to fight. Vlad employed scorched earth tactics with exceptional ruthlessness, destroying his own country to deny the invaders any resources. His soldiers launched night raids against Ottoman camps, spreading terror and paranoia throughout the massive army. Ottoman soldiers began to fear darkness itself, knowing that Vlad's men might emerge at any moment to slaughter them in their tents. Sleep became impossible. Exhaustion and fear eroded morale faster than any battlefield defeat. The Wallachian forces would strike suddenly, kill dozens or hundreds of enemy soldiers, and vanish before organized resistance could form. These attacks were accompanied by psychological warfare. Impaled Ottoman prisoners left near the camps, severed heads arranged in grotesque displays, and whispered rumors that Vlad possessed supernatural powers and could not be killed. The most horrifying moment of the campaign occurred when Mehmed's army approached Targoviste, Wallachia's capital. As they drew near the city, the soldiers encountered a sight that would be recorded in Ottoman chronicles with undisguised horror. A forest of stakes stretching for miles, bearing the impaled bodies of approximately 20,000 people. These were Ottoman prisoners of war, Turkish civilians captured during Vlad's raids, and Wallachian collaborators, all left to die in agony and rot in the summer heat. The bodies were arranged with deliberate care, creating lanes through which the Ottoman army had to march. The stench was overwhelming. The sight broke the will of hardened soldiers. Birds feasted on the corpses while some victims, impaled days earlier, still writhed in their death agonies. This forest of the impaled represented psychological warfare elevated to an art form, a message to Mehmed that Vlad would employ any level of horror to defend his territory. Contemporary Ottoman sources describe the Sultan's reaction to this macabre display. Mehmed II, a man who had personally overseen the brutal conquest of Constantinople and was no stranger to violence, reportedly turned pale and fell silent. One chronicler recorded him saying that he could not conquer a land ruled by a man willing to employ such methods, a ruler who understood terror better than the Ottomans themselves. The sight destroyed Ottoman morale completely. soldiers began deserting, spreading tales of Vlad as a demon or vampire who drank blood and felt no human mercy. Disease, likely dysentery from the poisoned water sources, spread through the camps. The combination of guerrilla warfare, psychological terror, scorched earth tactics, and epidemic disease made further advance impossible. Despite commanding an army 5 times larger than Vlad's forces, Mehmed II withdrew from Wallachia in defeat, a humiliation that shocked the Islamic world and elevated Vlad's reputation throughout Christian Europe. Yet Vlad's victory was Pyrrhic, achieved at catastrophic cost to Wallachia itself. The country lay devastated, its economy destroyed, its population decimated by war, famine, and Vlad's own brutal tactics. His methods, while militarily effective, had alienated potential allies and created enemies among his own people. The Wallachian boyar class, though terrorized into submission, secretly communicated with Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, seeking any opportunity to overthrow their terrifying prince. His brother Radu, now a trusted Ottoman general, led Turkish forces in subsequent campaigns against Wallachia, creating a fraternal conflict that epitomized the tragic consequences of their childhood captivity. Radu represented what the Ottomans had intended to create, a loyal, converted servant. Vlad represented their greatest failure, a student who had learned their lessons too well and turned those lessons against them. The political situation deteriorated rapidly after Mehmed's withdrawal. Matthias Corvinus, king of Hungary, who had initially supported Vlad as a bulwark against Ottoman expansion, grew concerned about having such an unstable and violent ruler on his border. There are suggestions that Corvinus feared Vlad might turn his methods northward if their alliance soured. In 1462, Corvinus arrested Vlad on dubious charges of treason, possibly including forged letters suggesting Vlad had been negotiating with the Ottomans. Vlad was imprisoned in Hungary for approximately 12 years, from 1462 to 1474. Even in captivity, his reputation for cruelty persisted. Guards reported finding impaled birds, mice, and insects in his cell, suggesting Vlad continued to practice his signature method of killing on whatever living creatures he could access. This disturbing detail, if accurate, reveals a man so fundamentally shaped by trauma and violence that cruelty had become not just a political tool, but a psychological compulsion. Released in 1474 as part of a renewed Hungarian-Ottoman conflict, Vlad reclaimed the Wallachian throne for a brief third reign in 1476. Yet he was no longer the feared ruler who had terrorized an empire. His power base had eroded during his imprisonment. Rivals had consolidated their positions, and the population had endured years of instability. Radu, his brother, had died in 1475, eliminating the possibility of reconciliation or final confrontation between the two men whose divergent responses to childhood trauma had set them on opposite paths. Vlad's final months were marked by constant warfare against Ottoman forces and internal enemies. In December 1476 or early January 1477, Vlad was killed in battle near Bucharest. The exact circumstances remain disputed. Some sources claim he was assassinated by disloyal Wallachian nobles, others that he fell in combat against Ottoman soldiers. His head was severed and sent to Sultan Mehmed II in Constantinople, where it was displayed on a stake as proof of his death and as symbolic vengeance for the humiliations he had inflicted on the empire. The immediate aftermath of Vlad's death saw his reputation torn between conflicting narratives. In Ottoman territories and among his Wallachian enemies, he was portrayed as a bloodthirsty tyrant, a sadistic monster whose cruelty exceeded all bounds of civilized behavior. German pamphlets, among the first mass-produced printed materials in Europe, depicted him as Dracula Wider or Vlad the Impaler, describing his atrocities in graphic detail, accompanied by woodcut illustrations of his torture methods. These publications, serving as early propaganda and sensationalist entertainment, spread his dark legend throughout Europe. The stories were exaggerated for effect, transforming a brutal but human ruler into a figure of almost supernatural evil. Yet underlying the exaggerations was a core of historical truth. Vlad had indeed employed terror on an unprecedented scale, had killed thousands through impalement and other forms of torture, and had demonstrated a capacity for cruelty that shocked even the violent 15th century. Paradoxically, within Romanian territories, Vlad's image evolved differently. Romanian folk traditions, while acknowledging his cruelty, portrayed him as a stern but just ruler who had defended Christian lands against Ottoman invasion. Stories emerged of his absolute justice, his elimination of crime, and his refusal to bow to foreign powers. The impalement of corrupt nobles and Ottoman invaders was reframed as righteous punishment against exploiters and enemies. This nationalist interpretation gained strength during periods of foreign domination, when Romanians needed symbols of resistance and independence. Vlad became a figure of cultural pride. Brutal, yes, but strong and uncompromising in defense of his people. This dual legacy as both monster and hero reflects the complex historical reality of a ruler whose methods were indefensible, but whose resistance to imperial powers resonated with subjugated populations. The transformation of Vlad III into the literary vampire Count Dracula represents the final evolution of his legend. In 1897, Irish author Bram Stoker published his Gothic novel Dracula, drawing inspiration from Romanian folklore about vampires and the historical accounts of Vlad the Impaler. Stoker's vampire combined the historical Vlad's association with Transylvania, his reputation for bloodlust, and his resistance to death with supernatural elements from European vampire mythology. The novel's success created a cultural phenomenon that has overshadowed the historical Vlad entirely in popular consciousness. Most people who recognize the name Dracula have no knowledge of the 15th century Wallachian prince whose childhood trauma and brutal reign inspired the character. This ironic immortality means Vlad's name has persisted for over 5 centuries, though divorced from its historical context. The psychological question that haunts Vlad's biography is whether his extreme cruelty was an inevitable response to his traumatic childhood, or whether he possessed an inherent capacity for sadism that captivity merely unleashed. Modern psychological understanding suggests that severe childhood trauma, particularly prolonged abuse during developmental years, can fundamentally alter personality structure. Individuals subjected to powerlessness and humiliation sometimes respond by seeking absolute power and inflicting on others the suffering they endured. Yet not all trauma victims become perpetrators. Vlad's brother Radu experienced identical captivity but chose adaptation rather than vengeance. This suggests that individual personality traits, perhaps including traits that would now be associated with antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy, interacted with environmental trauma to create the man Vlad became. It is worth considering what Vlad might have become without Ottoman captivity. As the second son of a minor prince, he might have lived a relatively obscure life, perhaps serving as a military commander or governing a small territory. The pride and ambition that characterized him would have found expression, but likely within normal parameters for nobility of his era. The 6 years in Ottoman hands transformed these traits into something monstrous. He learned that mercy was fatal, that fear was the only reliable tool of governance, and that extreme violence could achieve what diplomacy could not. His captors intended to break him into submission. Instead, they taught him the exact methods he would later use to resist them. The Ottomans created their most effective enemy by trying to create a loyal servant. The historical debate over Vlad's legacy continues among scholars. Some emphasize his role as a defender of Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion, noting that his resistance bought time for other regions to prepare defenses. Others focus on his exceptional cruelty, arguing that his methods cannot be justified regardless of the political context or his personal history of trauma. Romanian historians often struggle to balance national pride in a figure who resisted foreign domination with honest acknowledgement of his brutality. International scholars debate whether he should be understood primarily as a product of his violent era, a trauma victim whose suffering created a cycle of violence, or an individual whose personality would have expressed itself in cruelty regardless of circumstances. No consensus exists, perhaps because Vlad himself represents an uncomfortable truth, that victims can become perpetrators, that trauma can transform suffering into sadism, and that the line between hero and monster often depends on perspective. What remains indisputable is the historical impact of the 6 years an 11-year-old boy spent in Ottoman captivity. Those years forged a ruler whose methods would be remembered for centuries, whose name would become synonymous with terror, and whose legend would ultimately transcend history into myth. The Ottomans, seeking to create a compliant vassal prince, instead created Vlad III Dracula, the impaler, the voivode who understood that fear could be wielded like a weapon, and the child who learned his lessons so well that he surpassed his teachers in cruelty and psychological warfare. His story remains a dark testament to how captivity, abuse, and systematic psychological torture can transform a human being, creating from a noble child something the world would remember with horror for centuries to come. The boy who entered Ottoman captivity died there, even though his body survived. What emerged 6 years later was forged in pain, shaped by hatred, and destined to inflict on the world the suffering that had been inflicted upon him. The specific methods Vlad employed during his reign deserve closer examination, as they reveal the depth of psychological damage inflicted during his captivity. Beyond impalement, which became his signature, Vlad utilized a comprehensive arsenal of torture techniques that he had witnessed in Ottoman dungeons. Flaying alive was reserved for certain offenses, where executioners would slowly remove the victim's skin while keeping them conscious as long as possible. Victims would be tied to posts in public squares, and skilled torturers would work for hours, peeling skin from extremities inward, creating maximum pain while avoiding immediate death. The screams of the flayed could be heard throughout entire towns, serving as auditory reminders of the prince's power. These executions were not hidden or conducted in private. Vlad insisted they be public spectacles, forcing populations to witness and internalize the consequences of disobedience. Boiling alive represented another method in Vlad's repertoire of terror. Large cauldrons would be filled with water or oil and heated over fires in town centers. Victims would be slowly lowered into the liquid, sometimes feet first to prolong suffering, other times held at specific depths to maximize agony without causing immediate death. The method varied based on the perceived severity of the crime and Vlad's mood. Some sources describe him ordering victims boiled in stages. First, the feet and legs, allowed to cook while the victim remained conscious, then progressively deeper immersion. The psychological torture of watching others boil before one's own turn came was calculated cruelty, designed to break witnesses as thoroughly as it destroyed victims. Guards reported that many prisoners would beg for simple beheading or even impalement rather than face the cauldron. The breaking wheel was employed for those Vlad deemed particularly offensive to his rule. Victims would be tied spread-eagle to large wooden wheels, and executioners would use iron bars to systematically break every bone in their bodies. The process began with extremities, fingers, hands, feet, legs, and worked inward, ensuring the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. Between bone-breaking sessions, victims would be left displayed on the wheels for hours or days, their shattered bodies creating living monuments to Vlad's power. The wheels would be erected in prominent locations, town squares, crossroads, approaches to castles. Travelers entering Wallachia would encounter these displays and understand immediately the nature of the ruler who governed these lands. The screams of the broken, unable to move or escape their agony, served as constant background noise in Vlad's domains during executions. Mutilation without death was another favored punishment, particularly for crimes Vlad considered insufficiently severe to warrant execution, but serious enough to require permanent consequences. Thieves would lose hands, liars would have their tongues removed, adulterers would be mutilated in ways specific to their crimes. These mutilated individuals would be released back into society, living advertisements of Vlad's justice system. A man without hands could not steal again. A woman whose nose had been cut off bore permanent shame for adultery. A merchant whose eyes had been gouged out could not cheat customers with false weights again. This practical cruelty served dual purposes: punishment of the individual and deterrence for others. The mutilated became objects of fear and pity, walking reminders that challenged the community to consider whether any crime was worth such consequences. Vlad's treatment of women accused of sexual impropriety reveals particularly disturbing aspects of his psychology. Women suspected of adultery or premarital sexual activity would be subjected to invasive examinations, publicly shamed, and then punished with tortures specifically designed to target their sexuality. Breast mutilation, vaginal impalement, and public stripping were common. Some accounts describe Vlad ordering the skin of women's breasts to be peeled back, exposing raw flesh before forcing them to parade through towns. Others mention women impaled through the vagina on special stakes, their bodies displayed as warnings about sexual morality. These gender-specific tortures suggest that Vlad's time in Ottoman captivity may have included or exposed him to sexual trauma, creating particular psychological wounds around sexuality and power. The sexualized nature of some punishments indicates that his cruelty was not purely political calculation, but had deep psychological roots in his own traumatic experiences. The psychological manipulation Vlad employed extended beyond physical torture to elaborate mind games designed to break his victims mentally before they died physically. He would invite condemned prisoners to lavish final meals, discussing philosophy, religion, or politics with them in civilized conversation before suddenly ordering their execution. This juxtaposition of civilization and barbarity created profound psychological disorientation. Prisoners never knew which Vlad they faced: the educated prince who could discuss Aristotle and military strategy, or the monster who would order them impaled moments later. This unpredictability was itself a form of torture, keeping everyone around Vlad in a state of constant anxiety. Even his closest advisors and military commanders lived with the knowledge that a single wrong word or perceived disloyalty could result in agonizing death, regardless of past service or current favor. Stories from German pamphlets, while potentially exaggerated, describe Vlad's personal involvement in torture sessions. Unlike many rulers who delegated such activities to executioners, Vlad reportedly observed tortures closely, sometimes offering instructions on technique or pacing. One account describes him dining among the impaled, eating bread dipped in the blood of victims, though this detail likely represents propaganda rather than historical fact. However, more credible sources confirm that Vlad did personally attend executions and torture sessions, using them as opportunities to reinforce his image as an all-seeing, all-powerful ruler who missed nothing and feared nothing. His physical presence during these horrific events sent a message. This was not punishment delegated to subordinates, but justice personally administered by the prince himself. The economic impact of Vlad's terror regime demonstrates how thoroughly his Ottoman captivity had distorted his understanding of governance. While crime indeed disappeared and merchants could conduct business without fear of theft, the underlying economic system was paralyzed by fear. Innovation ceased because any new idea might displease the prince. Trade was hampered because foreign merchants feared traveling through Wallachia despite the safety from banditry. Agricultural production suffered because peasants, traumatized and depleted by conscription and Vlad's wars, could not work efficiently. The famous golden cup by the fountain represented not prosperity, but a population too terrified to act on basic human impulses like greed. This was order achieved through trauma rather than through social contract or genuine justice, and it proved unsustainable. When Vlad's power weakened, the system collapsed immediately because it had been built entirely on fear of one individual rather than on functional institutions or shared values. The night attack of 1462, when Vlad attempted to assassinate Sultan Mehmed II in his own camp, exemplifies the fusion of audacity and cruelty that defined his approach to warfare. Leading a force of approximately 10,000 men, Vlad launched a nighttime raid on the Ottoman camp, hoping to kill the Sultan and break the invasion through decapitation of leadership. The attack was meticulously planned, with Vlad's forces divided into multiple groups to create maximum chaos. They infiltrated the camp after midnight when soldiers were sleeping and began systematic slaughter. Ottoman sources describe the terror of waking to find enemies already among the tents, killing indiscriminately in the darkness. Vlad's men were under orders to kill without mercy, to create such chaos that the massive Ottoman army would panic and collapse. The raid killed thousands of Ottoman soldiers, but ultimately failed to locate Mehmed's tent among the vast encampment. The aftermath of the failed assassination attempt shows Vlad's strategic thinking even in defeat. Rather than retreating immediately, his forces continued harassing the Ottoman army, launching smaller raids, poisoning supplies, and spreading rumors that Vlad possessed supernatural abilities to appear and disappear at will. These tactics, learned from observing Ottoman psychological warfare during his captivity, proved remarkably effective. Ottoman soldiers, already demoralized by the scorched earth tactics and the forest of the impaled, began to believe they faced not a human enemy, but some demonic force. Desertion increased dramatically, with soldiers preferring to risk execution for abandonment rather than face another night in Wallachian territory. Mehmed's officers struggled to maintain discipline as fear corroded military order. Vlad had transformed the principles he learned in captivity, that fear was the ultimate weapon, into a comprehensive military strategy that allowed a vastly outnumbered force to defeat an empire. Vlad's relationship with the Orthodox Church reveals another layer of complexity in his character. Despite his extraordinary cruelty, he maintained close ties with Orthodox monasteries and positioned himself as a defender of Christian faith against Islamic expansion. He provided generous donations to churches, funded the construction and repair of monasteries, and presented himself in correspondence with other Christian rulers as a crusader fighting for Christendom. This religious positioning was partly strategic, garnering support from Catholic Hungary and other Christian powers, but also appears to have been genuinely held. Vlad seems to have compartmentalized his brutality as necessary political action while maintaining sincere religious devotion. This psychological compartmentalization, the ability to torture prisoners horribly while donating gold to churches, suggests a mind fundamentally fractured by the contradictions forced upon it during captivity. He had learned in Ottoman captivity that appearances could be deceiving, that surface civilization could mask underlying brutality, and he employed this lesson in reverse, maintaining religious piety while committing acts that violated every Christian teaching about mercy and compassion. The reports of Vlad's behavior during his Hungarian imprisonment provide disturbing insight into how deeply torture had become integrated into his psychology. Guards' accounts of finding impaled animals in his cell suggest that cruelty had become not merely a political tool, but a psychological compulsion, perhaps a method of maintaining control in a situation where he was again powerless. Modern psychological understanding of trauma suggests that victims sometimes compulsively repeat elements of their trauma, attempting to master through repetition what they could not control when originally victimized. If these accounts are accurate, Vlad's impalement of insects and small animals during imprisonment represents a tragic cycle. The boy, tortured in Ottoman captivity, became a man who could not stop torturing even when imprisoned himself, trapped in patterns of violence carved into his psyche during those formative years. The tortured had become the torturer, unable to imagine any other mode of existing in the world. The final irony of Vlad's life lies in how completely the Ottomans succeeded in destroying the boy while failing utterly to create the man they intended. They broke the 11-year-old prince from Wallachia, shattering whatever potential for mercy, compassion, or trust he might have possessed. Yet in breaking him, they created something far more dangerous than a rebellious hostage. They created a ruler who understood terror as well as they did, and was willing to employ it without the constraints of imperial policy or strategic calculation. Vlad's cruelty lacked the Ottoman Empire's bureaucratic organization. It was personal, intense, and driven by psychological wounds that never healed. The Ottomans used terror as a tool of governance. Vlad used it as an expression of his own damaged psyche projected onto the world. In trying to create a submissive vassal prince, Ottoman captivity instead forged a man who embodied the darkest aspects of their own system, amplified by personal trauma into something uniquely terrible. The question of whether Vlad should be condemned as a monster or understood as a victim of his circumstances admits no simple answer. Historical judgment must acknowledge both realities, that his childhood captivity and the systematic psychological torture he endured would damage anyone profoundly, and that his subsequent actions caused immense suffering to thousands of innocent people. Modern understanding of trauma does not excuse cruelty, but provides context for understanding how suffering can transform victims into perpetrators. Vlad's story represents an extreme example of this cycle. A child subjected to 6 years of calculated psychological breaking who emerged as an adult, incapable of governing except through the methods used against him. He learned in Ottoman captivity that power required absolute control, that fear was more reliable than love, and that mercy was weakness. These lessons, burned into his developing mind during critical formative years, became the principles that governed his reign and guaranteed his dark immortality in history and legend. The transformation of historical Vlad into the vampire Dracula represents a form of symbolic justice. A man who created forests of the dead, who drank metaphorically from the suffering of his victims, and who spread fear like a contagion, has been transformed into a literal monster who drinks blood and cannot die. Bram Stoker's Dracula, seeking to spread his vampiric curse across Europe, mirrors the historical Vlad's impact. Both spread fear and death far beyond their original territories. Both became symbols of inhumanity, and both achieved a form of immortality through the horror they inspired. The fictional vampire is more merciful than the historical prince. Dracula's victims die and transform, while Vlad's victims died slowly on stakes, their suffering maximized and prolonged. Yet the vampire legend has preserved Vlad's name when countless other brutal medieval rulers have been forgotten, ensuring that the boy broken in Ottoman captivity would be remembered forever, if not accurately. Ultimately, the story of Vlad III Dracula, the Impaler, the child hostage who became the embodiment of terror, serves as a dark meditation on the consequences of trauma, the cycle of violence, and the ways that cruelty can be transmitted across generations and populations. The Ottomans tortured 2 boys in their palace. One, Radu, bent and became their servant, perpetuating the system that had broken him by fighting for the empire against his own people. The other, Vlad, hardened and turned the weapons used against him back upon his captors, becoming a force of chaos and terror that ultimately destroyed himself along with thousands of others. Neither brother escaped the damage done during those 6 years. They simply expressed it differently. Their divergent paths demonstrate that trauma does not determine outcomes, but powerfully shapes possibilities. In the deep forests of the Carpathians, In the palace halls of Târgoviște, in the forests of the Impaled, the 11-year-old boy taken hostage in 1442 continued to die over and over in the thousands he sent to agonizing deaths. The Ottomans broke a child and created a monster. The monster is remembered, the child is forgotten, and that, perhaps, is the darkest tragedy of all.